Okay. Well, good morning, everyone here in person and online. I'm John Hoover, and as the director of the Mercantile Library, I'm pleased to welcome everyone. So this is a combined, some of you have been with us when we had the Coffee in the Gallery series pretty regularly, and we've always had that with simultaneously on Sundays. Those were usually on Fridays, and then on Sundays we had the colloquial series, and we're bringing those together for this next series that you've all signed up for, and we're so glad to have you. Today we have the enthusiasm and expertise of our newest staff member, Alyssa Pearson. She's the Aubash Early Career Special Collections Fellow here at the library. She's been in that position these last 2 years, all through the pandemic time. And that was funded by the family of an early founder of the library, William Wayne Scott, and who served us very faithfully from the 1870s through about the 1890s. So we're really thinking about history all the time these days, you know, histories and commemoration and memories, and how appropriate it is that the curators here wanted to get behind the exhibition that they let me put up downstairs on Americana as a way of life at the Mercantile. And Alyssa today especially is going to look at New Americana, past Americana, New Americana. What an appropriate thing to do when we're looking at the anniversary of the library, the 175th anniversary. This place is steeped in memories. So I'm going to ask Alyssa to take it from here, and we're so glad to have her. Please welcome her.
I'm vaccinated, and I'm going to take this off just to make it easier to hear me because I'm often told that I speak too quietly. Is that a sign to speak up already? Okay. Okay. Thank you for that, John. I'm just going to switch to sharing my screen. Here. Here we go. Okay. So, oh, the lights. Thank you for your patience with me here. All right, we're good? Okay, I think we're set now. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening in on my presentation today. My name is Alyssa Pearson, and I'm the Aubash Collections Access Librarian here at the Mercantile. I was honored that our director, John Cooper, asked me to present on some of our more recently acquired special collections items. While much of our collections have been held here since the Mercantile's earliest days, we are continually acquiring and growing. It is a vital part of what we do here. It helps us add to the expanding definition of what makes something a piece of Americana, and as a result, gives us a more comprehensive picture of American history. I've titled my presentation New Americana, Personal History, because I believe studying history is a deeply personal thing. At least it can and should be, if we're paying close enough attention. And while on the one hand, the items I'll be showing you today could be seen as a sort of cabinet of curiosities, which is fun and educational in its own right, at the risk of sounding a little woo-woo, I've selected them for presentation because they spoke to me in particularly visceral ways. A little context about myself. I was a bit of an odd kid. My favorite books from the time I could read, besides the more macabre, such as anything by R.L. Stine and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, were historical nonfiction. I guess because I was enthralled by the fact that they were about real people who lived through these true, incredible events. And I was not satisfied with the limited stories I heard in history classes at school. Truth really is often stranger than fiction, after all. But even though I sought out these stories as much as I could, I still grew up with a very limited understanding of the world. I'm from a very small town in South Dakota. My favorite day at school was when the bookmobile came every 2 weeks as a way to supplement our rather modest school library. I was fascinated by the world outside of where I came from, but I was also terrified by it. This was a theme in my life until relatively recently. What changed for me, I think, was when I started to see myself as part of this larger narrative. When I realized that my story has value and meaning, just as much as any of the historical figures that I used to read about. You see, I didn't often see myself represented in those stories, and representation matters. It helps you believe in possibilities. It helps you understand yourself. It helps you empathize with those around you, whether they're alike or different. And the thing is, it gives us all a truer knowledge of the histories of our communities, our nation, and the entire world. Because history is not the rote memorization of names, dates, and unconnected events. History is not only what rich and powerful men wrote centuries ago. It is not just the glories of war. History includes all of those, yes, but history also includes the people to whom we cannot give names and faces. History is what ordinary people lived every day. It's stories that make you say, why have I never heard that before? And why don't more people know about this? It's stories that make us feel a collective sense of grief sometimes. History is the story of untold numbers of people who were purposely unrepresented because they were deemed unimportant, outcasts, or sometimes even dangerous to the dominant narrative. American history in particular is not what most of us have learned growing up in school. At least it certainly was not the whole story. New Americana means encompassing all of the rich and varied stories which represent America, triumphant and tragic, extraordinary and ordinary, famous and unknown, because all of our experiences have meaning. You may or may not have yet explored the Mercantile Library's general scrapbook collection, an assortment of various personal albums. Well, we've recently acquired several new albums which fall under the full umbrella of the general scrapbook collection, and each tells a different story. I couldn't think of a better example of personal history than these items. While preparing for this presentation, I asked John if he could tell me about the Mercantile's history with scrapbook collecting. He explained to me that scrapbooks have been collected here from the earliest days of the library. One of the very first was a collection of 17 scrapbooks donated by James S. Thomas, who served as mayor of St. Louis for 3 terms beginning in 1864. Another early collection of 10 scrapbooks was compiled by a journalist named Adolphus Benedict, who was active during the Civil War in the Gilded Age. The Thomas and Benedict scrapbooks are exceedingly important cultural and political resources about St. Louis in the mid-19th century. Digging further into the scrapbook collections, though, John described a sort of opening of the floodgates over the past 40 years when it comes to the Mercantile acquiring new albums. To me, this represents the acknowledgement that ordinary people have always had something valuable to contribute to the library's holdings. I asked John if I could write down the way he described these antique scrapbooks. He spoke of them as personal memoirs, something tangible to capture fleeting events in a person's life. They also served as a way of reconstructing people's own sequence of events and coming to terms with important news. It's easy to see this demonstrated in the albums I've chosen to feature here today. Something I've learned while processing these new collection items is the many forms in which scrapbooks present themselves. One type in particular is the autograph album. There is a long history to autograph albums that stretches all the way back to the 16th century in German-speaking regions of Europe. At that time, it was a fad among students who wanted to preserve their books, not only for sentimental reasons, but also as evidence of their academic qualifications. By the late 17th century, autograph books fell out of fashion. It was revived a century later among middle-class people, with women then joining the ranks of autograph collectors. German immigrants brought this custom over to the United States around the 1820s, and it reached the height of its popularity around the time of the Civil War. It remained a widespread practice for several more decades, until autograph books were ultimately replaced by the tradition of signing high school yearbooks. Autograph albums during the Victorian period often included elaborate drawings, colored pages, and embellished covers. The earlier albums were generally more plain in design and encouraged serious inscriptions and lofty sentiments rather than the cheeky signatures we associate with yearbooks of the 20th century. But each individual album is unique to its creator, which is what makes them so personal and, in my opinion, so charming. Some inscriptions reflected the grim realities of keeping in contact during a time when transportation and communication were neither easy nor expeditious. For example, one passage in an album that you'll be seeing today is signed off saying, "May we meet in heaven." One of the first collection items I ever processed here was a beautiful purple velvet autograph book in which its owner had gone back to each note left by a friend or family member and written the date of their death. I think this demonstrates just how treasured these items were to the people who kept them. Today, we are blessed with the technological capability to easily keep in contact with loved ones, even seeing their faces from thousands of miles away. I think some of my family's actually on right now. Social media allows us to keep up with the happenings of the people we care about, and cell phones effortlessly capture moments of our lives in photo and video form. It's all easy to take for granted, but for the people who created these autograph albums and scrapbooks, sometimes a few lines and a signature might be all one would have to memorialize a friend. These albums represent lives full of love and friendship, of happiness, but also despairing events. They document items of personal significance, but also illustrate people trying to make sense of what was happening in our nation and the world, and trying to find their place in all of it. This first one is an engraved autograph album owned by a woman named Emma Louisa McCarty of New York. She wrote in it from 1827 to 1833. Inscriptions of that date make this a very early American example of the trend. This album fits the more traditional form of autograph books and contains mainly flowery prose by friends. But it also includes some newspaper clippings, illustrations cut from cards, a few pressed leaves, and a few drawings. I thought this pencil drawing was pretty impressive. The first page of this album includes an entry that I thought very fitting. It says, "On memories after, let them throw a little wreath of rhyme. In future ages, 'twill serve to show their rapid flight of time." Oh, yep. Sorry about that. Is that better? Okay. Okay. So this next one is an album that was owned by Mary E. Holloway of Poolsville, Indiana, and it includes entries from 1854 to 1861. She is variably addressed as Etta or Molly throughout the album. Here you can see that this album was sold as a friendship tablet. Miss Holloway used her book primarily to compile messages written by classmates and teachers at Fort Wayne College. Next to one particular entry from a friend, Miss Holloway pasted a cryptic message. It says, "I would woo thee if I dare, in thy joys and sorrows share." This souvenir album was gifted to a young woman in Illinois named Martha Reed, affectionately called Maddie throughout the book. It was given to her by her mother, Matilda J. Reed, on May 9, 1863, as a birthday present. Her mother very sweetly filled the first page with a poem titled "A Mother's Wish," which you can see on the right here. One verse from the poem reads, "Not in a hosmer's footsteps tread would I my daughter see, nor yet a beecher's gifted head do I desire for thee, but blessed of careful Martha's hands and loving Mary's heart, a Dorcas in the social bands of the true vine of art." Of course, she's referencing Harriet Hosmer here, the famed artist whose sculpture, Beatrice Genchi, was gifted to the Mercantile Library in 1857. She also references Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of the highly influential anti-slavery novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. While Maddie's mother does not foresee her daughter becoming a renowned artist or writer, she praises her biblical attributes and assures her she loves her all the same. The album includes some beautiful calligraphy, such as the entry of the bird depicted here as well. What I found touching about Miss Reed's album is that she has entries all the way up through 1905. She clearly treasured this book deeply as it encompasses over 40 years of love and friendship. Whoever created this next scrapbook must have felt a significant sense of loss at the death of former President Ulysses S. Grant. In tribute, the album's creator pasted hundreds of pages of newspaper clippings, which detail U.S. Grant's final days, describing the urgency he had felt to write his memoirs in order to provide for his family after his passing. It includes tributes from people around the world and tells the details of his burial. We do not know the name of the creator of this album. The entries date from 1876 to 1886 in Rockville, Indiana. The young woman who owned this album utilized it in several ways. Included within it are poems clipped from newspapers, some commemorating the dead, some humorous, some about love, some very dramatic ones about lighthouses. Also pasted in are prayers, a model love letter, which I found interesting, and prose about womanhood. Intermixed are messages written by friends or perhaps love interests. Some pages are more lighthearted than others and include short little riddles or jokes. A few of my favorites. The young man who wants to get up with the sun must not sit up late with the daughter. An uncle asked a train conductor, "I suppose you won't charge for this, little man?" The conductor then asked a child, "How old are you, little sir?" To which the boy replied, "I am 5 when I am at home, but 3 when traveling." A little girl being asked on the first day of school how she liked her new teacher replied, "I do not like her. She is just as saucy to me as my mother." The album owner collected many colorful illustrations as well. Most are pretty floral arrangements, vibrant birds, kittens, or fashionably dressed young women. But some, like the one you see here, I have to imagine just made her giggle. It's a baby riding some kind of flying bug, pulling another baby in a floral carriage. She compiled recipes, like one for cake icing. Scattered throughout the album are Christmas, New Year, and birthday cards. Like this one, and invitations to dances, weddings, and other social events. I thought it would be fun to show some of these cards, as many of them are miniature. So what I'm going to do is switch over to our document camera. So this, let me make sure this is all focused on here. Look good? Okay, so a lot of the pages are filled with these little miniature cards, which I absolutely love. So I thought I would just demonstrate how they would work. They're very decorative. There's even a little pink felt in there. These are my favorites because they're so tiny. New Year's cards. And then they just have the name of the person. This one is David Strauss. And then this little top hat. I'll put this out on the table so that everyone can get a closer look at it. The album takes a somber turn at times with the death and funeral announcements of those close to the young woman, like the one pictured here of a young man who died of consumption. A series of newspaper clippings tells the tragic story of a young family ravaged by consumption as well. A mother dying in 1886 of the illness, and her husband's only child dying less than 2 years later at the age of 3. A small part of the announcement reads, Though the little boy was idolized by his father and his grandparents, words are inadequate to comfort those from whose household he has gone. All may hope that where he has gone, his mother was waiting with outstretched arms to receive her little son. The album does not end on a sorrowful entry, however. I found this clipping particularly amusing. It's titled Woman's Capabilities, and although it's mostly humorous, it ends on a quite empowering note. It says a woman can do anything or everything and do it well. She can do more in a minute than a man can in an hour and do it better. She can make the alleged lords of creation bow down to her own sweet will and they will never know it. I don't know about you, but I'd like to meet the woman who made this scrapbook. Oh, thanks. Sorry. This was a rather interesting one. It was not at all what I anticipated when I opened its cover. A young woman whose identity is unknown created her scrapbook inside the pages of a farmer's ledger, which dates back to 1816, but her handiwork dates back to around the year 1900. As you can see here, she was fond of fashion. Most of the clippings are of stylish women and children, although there are some amusing advertisements like these for Armour's pork and beans and Pettyjohn's breakfast food. But my favorite portion of this book includes the pages on which she pasted wallpaper samples. She used this scrapbook as a sort of inspiration board for interior design. You can see here that she labeled this top one kitchen and the other pantry. And then this one is labeled nursery. As a personal aside, I love following people online who restore old houses, and some of the most exciting moments are when they accidentally discover a home's original wallpaper. So I got particularly excited about these pages. This next item is a school notebook, which also served as a scrapbook for a Miss Maybelle Arnold in St. Louis during the years 1930 to 1933. She was a student at Gleason High School and doodled her school spirit across the front of her binder, as you can hopefully kind of see here. Cheerleading chants, illustrations, messages from friends, and MA plus TW are just a few inscriptions. In the portion of her notebook titled First Year Home Ec, Maybelle pasted fabric samples, like those pictured here, describing the material, size, price, and types of items for which each would be most appropriate. She also displays her fashion design skills, drawing a model alongside fabrics she would use to create the outfits depicted. Here are a few of those. Maybelle also displayed a particular interest in French culture, pasting the latest news clippings, including one about St. Louisans abroad in Paris, as well as the latest Parisian fashions, like these stylish women wearing black satin gowns at the racetrack. Intermixed throughout are writing assignments coupled with stern reminders by her teacher and doodles from classmates. It is a charming time capsule of life as a high school girl in 1930s St. Louis. Adjacent to scrapbooks, another type of personal memorabilia found in the Mercantile Special Collections is family photo albums. Shown here are the contents of an undated, unnamed Missouri family album, which appears to span around the years 1900 to 1915. The reason I found this album so charming was the candid nature of the photographs and the genuine looks of joy captured by the camera. You can see at the top here, a group of young people toasting each other with their pints at a bowling alley, and a family photo in front of a Christmas tree, complete with a child on a rocking horse. Young men and women's groups of friends posing for the camera. Days on the river, boating and swimming. What appears to be a colonial costume party. A car ride gone awry. And a couple of little farmers hard at work. Throughout, the album documents road trips out west, train and boat rides, fishing excursions, and simple family gatherings at home. It's a wonderfully intimate glimpse into ordinary American family life at the turn of the 20th century. This next new collection item might come as a bit of a surprise. It is a Civil War surgical set made by John F. Cummerell in 1860. As you may have guessed, the tools in this set were used for amputations. Why would I include such an item in this presentation? Because often Americana collections represent nostalgia for a bygone era that can include the glorification of war. But there is no beautifying the history behind this object. It is a tangible reminder of the horrifying realities of the American Civil War, the massive scale on which Americans saw suffering and death. The Civil War changed how Americans thought about death and dying in ways that permeate our culture to this day. Is it any wonder when we dive into this story? According to the U.S. National Library of Medicine, approximately 60,000 surgeries, about 3/4 of all operations performed during the Civil War, were amputations. Based on the estimated numbers of physicians allowed to perform surgeries during the war, it is likely that this single surgical kit that I will show you was utilized in the amputations of at least 100 Union soldiers. Learning why and when to perform an amputation was paramount to treating the massive numbers of casualties. Amputation performed within 24 to 48 hours after surgery was considered a primary amputation. A secondary amputation was one performed more than 3 days after after injury. It was soon recognized that primary amputation saved lives with a mortality rate of 28%, as opposed to the secondary rate of 52%. The reason for this was that waiting to operate more often than not resulted in a horribly infected wound. I am going to switch to the document camera again, and I need to put gloves on, so bear with me. Thank you for your patience. It is a very humid day. So the tools in this kit are going to illustrate just how delicate a process amputation was to perform. So in this first section, you can see there are several different knives. There's a large tweezer, probes, and there are actually some bullets. Actually, let's do this. And then underneath, forceps, part of a tourniquet. Obviously, this is a bone saw. And then underneath that, I discovered, because I had to do some research on this, that this was actually used for the skull. And then there is a small chainsaw. Amputations were widely feared by soldiers, in part because they were sometimes performed without the use of anesthesia, but they were often deemed necessary because of the considerable damage mini balls caused when they struck soldiers. They splintered bones, damaged muscle, and drove dirt, clothing, and other debris into the wounds. The operation was intended to prevent deadly complications such as gangrene. And while surgeons were widely accused of being butchers, amputations were a more quick and effective way for them to treat as many patients as possible in a short amount of time, given the circumstances. I could spend so much more time on this item, but I don't want to mistakenly assume that everyone listening has a strong stomach. My point in including this kit is that for the duration of the Civil War, One of the most formative times in our nation's history, these events were the reality for an overwhelming number of people. I threw a lot of numbers at you during this description, but each of those numbers represents someone who lost a limb and sometimes their life. That is no small thing, and I feel it deserves our acknowledgement. This will be out on the table for display after as well. This next collection item is a curious piece of American history. It was created in St. Louis as a commemoration of the centennial of America's Declaration of Independence and is a relic of the Reconstruction period, a depiction of formerly enslaved people's circumstances in the aftermath of the Civil War. This chromolithograph on heavy cardstock was commissioned by St. Louis and Anna Adams Philly in 1875. It is exceedingly rare, as there is only one other known surviving copy, which is located at the American Antiquarian Society. I thought for a long time about how I wanted to describe this collection item, but I'll start with some background on Mrs. Philly. Anna Elizabeth Adams Philly, born in 1831, was the wife of the 18th mayor of St. Louis, Chauncey I. Philly, who served as mayor during the Civil War. Mrs. Philly was an active member of the community when it came to causes of social justice and was an ardent supporter of Abraham Lincoln. She commissioned this chromolithograph to raise funds for establishing a trade school for Black women in St. Louis. Mrs. Philly devoted much of her life to establishing the trade school, but sadly she died before she could achieve that goal. Her March 9, 1896 obituary in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch described her plans and states that she reasoned it was useless to expect newly free people to have good lives unless they were afforded opportunities. As far as I can tell in my research, no one else tried to take up and complete her noble cause following her death. The main caption under the illustration states, "Lived to see the triumph of liberty, justice, and humanity." Beneath that inscription is another which says, "In commemoration of the 100th anniversary of American independence, to aid in establishing a trade school for colored women at St. Louis, Missouri." There's a lot to unpack in this image, I think. The information on the back of the frame describes it in this way. The scene depicts a pair of infant boys, one white and one black, sitting near a rock, March 1776. The white infant reaches for a pair of butterflies while the black child sits on his knees with his hands shackled behind him. In the center of the scene, an elderly Black man stands with his arms upraised to the heavens, his shackles on the ground in front of him. Next to him sits an elderly white man, a veteran of the Union Army, sitting on his blue coat and leaning on his long bayoneted rifle. The old veteran gestures towards the shackles on the ground. The two men are arranged near a rock reading 1876. The implication is that the Black child born in the year of American independence is now a free man in 1876. While the intent behind this is certainly admirable, I can't help but think that this depiction portrays formerly enslaved Black people as being indebted to white sympathizers for their freedom, obscuring the fact that almost 180,000 Black men served with the Union Army themselves. Additionally, enslaved people struggled for centuries to gain their freedom before their cause was ever taken up by white abolitionists. This image places the old white veteran in a position that appears to say, "Look at what I've done for you," to the formerly enslaved Black man. Studying this image, I was reminded of the lesson plan I created about slave narratives for our anniversary educational series. This is because, like many of the slave narratives published in the mid-19th century, this image carries a sort of Black message in a white envelope. The message is Black freedom, but it is presented in a way that lacks context. It was created by white people for white people to purchase. So while the cause it championed was noble and important, particularly for what it could have meant to Black women's futures in St. Louis, knowing the perspective from which it comes is equally important if we are to understand the Reconstruction period in United States history. Lastly, I wanted to feature this next acquisition because it was one that decidedly made me say, why didn't I know about this? Why have I never heard of this person? This has happened to me so often since I started working here at the Mercantile, and it's usually something to do with St. Louis area history. This time, I was saying it about Kathryn Dunham. The newspaper clippings in this collection center around a gala that was held in her honor at Carnegie Hall in New York City on Martin Luther King Day, 1979. At this gala, Dunham was presented with the Albert Schweitzer Music Award for her contributions to the performing arts and her dedication to humanitarian work. Many of you may know of her since she did so much good work in the surrounding community. Or you may know of her because she is a world-renowned dancer, choreographer, author, educator, anthropologist, and social activist. But maybe like I did recently, you're thinking to yourself ashamedly that you've never heard of her at all. I feel strongly that Kathryn Dunham deserves a more prominent place in American history books. Here's a little of her story. Kathryn Dunham was born on June 22nd, 1909 in Chicago. She grew up singing in her church. When she was 8 years old, she scandalized the elders of her church by doing a cabaret party performance in order to raise money. She never thought about a career in dance, though. Rather, intending to become a teacher, she followed her brother to the University of Chicago, where she became one of the first Black women to attend. There, she earned bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees in anthropology. But because that was apparently not enough of a challenge for her, she also became a ballet student of Ludmila Sperantseva, formerly of the Moscow Theater. She formed her first Black dance company in 1930, and then opened her first dance school in 1933. Throughout the 30s, she received grants to study dance in the Caribbean, received a degree in philosophy from the University of Chicago, continued to perform with her dance company throughout the United States, performed in her first film, and choreographed for Broadway. Dunham revolutionized American dance, pioneering in the use of folk and ethnic choreography. She completed groundbreaking work on Caribbean and Brazilian dance anthropology as a new academic discipline, and is credited for bringing Caribbean and African influences to a European-dominated dance world. She created the Dunham technique, an African-American dance form inspired by traditional African dance, modern dance, and ballet. During the 40s, she continued working as a dancer and choreographer, opened a nightclub at the Hotel Sherman in Chicago, toured the US in a Broadway production, and appeared in more films. She opened another dance school, this time in New York. She spoke out against segregated venues and refused to perform in them. She published her first book, performed in London, Brussels, Paris, and Rome, and delivered an address to the Royal Anthropological Society. She and her husband adopted a daughter at the close of this decade. In the 1950s, her dance company toured Central and South America, Europe, North Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. She regularly performed on television and in film, and published another book. In the early 1960s, Dunham performed mainly in New York. Then, in 1964, Dunham settled in East St. Louis and took up the post of artist-in-residence at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. There she brought anthropologists, sociologists, educators, scientists, writers, musicians, and theater professionals together to create a liberal arts curriculum. She received a $400,000 grant from the Federal Office of Economic Opportunity, but was thwarted by local politicians who did not share her vision. Thankfully, the Equal Opportunity Commission, as part of the Southern Illinois University's experiment in higher education, funded Dunham's proposal for creating a performing arts training center in East St. Louis. The same year, she established classes at Rock Junior High School in East St. Louis. Following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, Dunham encouraged community members to come to the center and use drumming and dance to vent their anger and despair. The PATC teaching staff was made up of former members of Dunham's touring company, as well as local residents. She refined and taught the Dunham technique to new generations of dance students. She lectured every summer until her death at annual master seminars in St. Louis, which attracted dance students from around the world. She established the Kathryn Dunham Centers for Arts and Humanities in East St. Louis to preserve Haitian and African instruments and artifacts from her personal collection. At the gala featured in these clippings, she was honored by former students, one of whom just so happens to be the incomparable Eartha Kitt. Kathryn Dunham continued dancing and choreographing and completing academic and activist work until she passed away in 2006 at the age of 96. I feel lucky to have finally been introduced to her extraordinary life through the processing of this collection. Of course, these items represent only a small showing of the Mercantile's recently acquired collections, but I really hope you've enjoyed this presentation as much as I enjoyed putting it together. I get to learn new things every day at the Mercantile, not only from each of my brilliant colleagues, but also from people long departed through the objects they've left behind. Here's to many future years of collecting at the Mercantile, and here's to all of our individual stories, because they matter. Thank you so much for listening. I'll open it up for any questions now, and if you're joining us virtually, feel free to type any questions in the chat and Brittany will relay them to me. Oh, the lights, sorry. I also forgot to turn that light off there. I guess, yes, John.
Isn't it interesting how rare that St. Louis imprint print is?
It is so, yeah, it's so rare. There's only one other known copy.
Yeah, and there's sometimes with the evidence of the lack of prominence of such an important illustration, there must be a story there about that rarity.
Yeah, it's interesting because you'd assume that it was widely printed since it was supposed to be a fundraiser.
Yeah, right. I've never seen it before.
Yeah, we have one of two only known copies. Yeah.
What's the approximate size of the items in this collection? Not the total special collections, but in this general category.
In the category of like scrapbooks?
Yeah.
That is a good question.
Well, the Baker collection alone has about 60 scrapbooks in it. So just multiply that out.
Okay, it includes the Baker collection.
And then, yeah, so those two early scrapbook collections that John told me about had, one of them had 17 scrapbooks and one had 10 scrapbooks. And then, of course, we have lots of individual scrapbooks. And there's the Snow Wary scrapbooks.
Chuck Berry.
The Chuck Berry scrapbooks are being held here right now and on display in the exhibition. Yeah.
Do you ever have any problems with thinking of the cloud now and that we don't have to decide what should be saved and not saved?
That's a good question. We battle the cloud every day. I feel like that we're in some form or another. You mean like saving them online? Yeah, we definitely try to create backups of things because we scan a lot of these items so that we have digital copies of them, but it's still, I think it's still really, really important to have these physical examples of them in our collections as well. The digital copies make it easier for us to share things that are too fragile, though, to put on display, which is good. But yeah, it's a hard balance sometimes. Yeah.
We've heard.
Yeah, and we're always learning because that technology is constantly evolving, and so we have to change and evolve with it and stay up to date. Yeah. Yes.
Are there in St. Louis any collections of the portrait, photographic portrait producers, such as Jules Furlow was one in Clayton years ago, and he took pictures of families and portraits of them. Has anyone got any? Has anyone saved any of that sort of thing?
I'm sure we probably have portrait collections, don't we, John? Yeah. I haven't personally gotten my hands on those specifically, but I'm fairly new, so I'm sure I'll come across them, but Don, do you want to say anything more about that?
Well, it's a good question, and some of the portrait photographers, the family still hold some of those, Joe. And so speak it up, the Mercantile is always looking to collect things.
Alyssa, we have a question from Jan. Do you know if there are any living relatives of the person's scrapbooks? And if so, have you ever, or will you ever be able to speak with them to see if they have further insight or stories?
That's such a good question. I thought about that while I was processing the items. It's definitely something I would be interested in doing, because I do like to also do genealogical research in my free time. Actually, I was able to find records of of Maybelle's home ec teacher online. I did a little cursory search, but as far as locating actual descendants of the people who created the scrapbooks, it would be really fun to do, but it would also be really daunting and time consuming, but maybe someday. Yeah.
You know who was, you know who was?
I do not, and I know that was one of the first things I noticed. The outside of this school notebook is so fun because it just, I mean, some things don't change. Like it's 1930, but it might as well have been my notebook, you know, in school. And so yeah, she obviously had a little crush on somebody.
I'm taken by your observation that you just learned of Kathryn Dunham, because you made me think about the fact that as well as I knew her, because during her lifetime before her death, she received quite an ongoing in the newspaper,
Right.
in the news
Accolades.
kind of
Yeah,
life,
yeah.
right? And she would be so significant today with the expanding observation, if you will, of the African-American population who have had so much impact on the St. Louis region that, you know, I'm a listener of St. Louis Public Radio, and maybe you could talk to them about coming back to some kind of programming on dancers.
Yeah.
Because St. Louis is well known for the dancers who
Yes.
are here now and, you know, were here many years ago. But it's when we said that, like, you only learned
Yeah.
it's, you know, it's an age reflection. Too,
Well,
right?
it's probably partially some of that. It's also, if I was from this area originally, maybe I would have come across her sooner. But I also think it speaks to just how much more notoriety people like Kathryn Dunham should really have. And so as much as she was certainly honored during her lifetime, obviously, we have to keep that memory alive. So yeah, it would be interesting to see if she would be featured now in some form or another. St. Louis music history is just boundless, and so I'm always learning that some so-and-so that I had no idea was from here or did something significant in music history. So yeah, I was fascinated by her.
Do you have anything on Josephine Baker?
Yes, there's actually a couple of things of her on display right now. There is a signed photograph of her, and she's another person who that really touched me when I realized her story. And so yeah, she's also, I mean, the fact that she was born in the Mill Creek neighborhood, Mill Creek Valley neighborhood of St. Louis, she watched people running over the bridge from East St. Louis to escape the massacre that happened there. I believe in 1920, 1921, around there, and just the fact that she had such an impact across the world too. But it started right here, like a lot of people from St. Louis.
So just in case folks watching online may not have heard who he was asking about, can you just repeat?
Yes, he asked about Josephine Baker.
Thank you.
Yeah.
might want to summarize some of these questions, just because I'm not sure, especially if people.
Maybe I
ask
can
about
repeat
it.
them. Yeah, I'll repeat them if there's any other. Sarah.
As younger generation, or I guess my question is, do you feel like these types of Americana narratives presented in these formats are timeless and people will continue to create albums like this and scrapbooks? Or do you think that younger generations will turn to different formats for conveying these stories? And if so, what does that mean about the future of collecting institutions like ours and how we'll still capture those stories?
Yeah, that's the big question, I think. So to summarize it, did you say, okay. It's really hard to say. I try to think about, I used to be a middle school teacher, so anytime people talk about younger generation, I think about my students that I used to have, and I wonder these kinds of things. And I have to say that I really don't know. I think that a lot of their keepsakes and mementos are, for better or worse, in digital form. But I think that can be okay as long as we can figure out how to preserve those things in a way that really transports people to that time and place. And it's really difficult, as you pointed out earlier. I don't know. I wish that I could say that kids were still making scrapbooks and keeping their friends' signatures, but I really don't know. I certainly did. I'm sure you did at some point, like when we were in school. But whatever form it takes, I'm sure we'll figure out how to preserve it.
A collection of TikToks, right?
A collection of TikToks, yes.
Julie had a question. She says, I think you mentioned the one scrapbook is made and what had been a farmer's ledger. Is that right? And what other formats have you seen in scrapbooks? Are they all in books made for that purpose?
That's a good question too. So that one was really interesting. Yes, it was a farmer's ledger, and that's on display on the front of this table right here. I have to imagine it was an old family member's maybe lying around the house, and she just picked it up because no one was using it and started pasting things into it. But it's actually not uncommon. Several of the other scrapbooks are just books that have images and letters pasted into them. They're old books. The Grant's scrapbook is a book about diplomatic correspondence or something that someone pasted newspaper clippings into. But then some of them were obviously given as gifts or bought specifically for the purpose of creating an autograph book or scrapbook. And Emma McCarthy's is one that actually has her name inscribed on it. Yeah, so they come in all different forms. So, if there are no other questions, you can obviously, we can chat afterwards, but Sarah's going to help me. I'm John's coming back up while he's doing that. Sarah and I are going to put these two items out on display. We just ask that you please do not touch them and do not set any food or drink on this table, but yeah.
Thank you again. I can always recommend you to have refreshments and some coffee in the gallery. However, now I'm thinking about Roland's comment about the collection here. So often scrapbooks are rare because they're thrown away, and even you would almost have to be at one time in a rare book library a very luminous historical figure before the scrapbook would have been saved, that would have been with your personal papers. And quite often when I started, there were decisions made by archivists whether they should keep the scrapbooks or not, as opposed to the papers themselves. And can you imagine estate sales and yard sales where scrapbooks just ended up in the dumpster? So every one that we save now is really a registration with how important these personal narratives have become to us. And Alyssa, I've never heard a better description about why they're that important. So thank you again. And I'm glad that we're taking this briefing so that we can share this again online. So thank you again for all of you being here. And I hope that you'll be back for our next presentation in a few weeks. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.